5. The incident. Elena was midway through refilling a water glass when it happened. A waiter, Jonas, barely 18, tripped over the hem of the tablecloth at table 4. The tray of wine goblets tipped, then fell, sending 12 Riedel glasses and a full bottle of white crashing into the floor with an almost operatic shatter. The room turned to ice. The ambassador's wife let out a gasp as wine splattered across her sleeve. Jonas stood frozen, face pale, mouth half open. No one moved, not even the harpist. Elena reacted. She stepped forward, lifted the tablecloth, pulled the broken stemware toward the edge and away from the guest's feet, shielded Jonas from the worst of the attention. But Mrs. Harrow was already striding across the room, heels like gunshots. Who was responsible? Jonas opened his mouth. Elena stepped in front of him. I was, she said. Harrow's eyes narrowed. She looked from Elena to the glass, to Jonas, back to Elena. Out, now. 6. The hall of mirrors. Elena was escorted to the east corridor, a cold hallway lined with mirrors. She stood there for a long moment, staring at herself, noticing the loose strands of hair that had fallen from her bun, the red mark on her neck from the silver tray's handle, the smudge of wax near her elbow. She looked tired, older, like someone who'd spent her life polishing chandeliers she was never allowed to stand beneath. A faint knock on the doorframe. She turned, and there he was, Wilhelm Hallstein, standing without, his cane, alone. His suit was flawless charcoal gray with a pocket square the color of frost. His eyes, still sharp after 7 decades, locked onto her like she was a riddle he hadn't solved. You lied, he said. She froze. Yes, she said softly. Why? To protect him. Why? Because I've been him. He took a slow breath, then walked forward until only a few steps remained between them. You look like Rosa, he said finally. I've heard. She hated red, but it always looked good on her. Elena's heart thudded once, loud and sudden. Wilhelm's gaze lingered, then almost absently. There's a crack in the chandelier, you know. The big one. It'll fall eventually. All heavy things do. He turned, walked away, and for the first time in her life, Elena didn't feel like dust. She felt like the fracture, the one no one noticed, until everything came crashing down. Chapter 3. Eyes from the dark. The night had grown long, heavier than most. A low fog clung to the stone paths outside Hallstein Manor like a whisper trying not to be heard. Inside, the great estate lay still, as if listening. Elena had not gone to bed. Something about the air unsettled her. It wasn't just the remnants of the gala or the broken porcelain incident. There had been many parties before, many humiliations. But tonight, the silence in the house felt too complete. It felt like an ending. She found herself wandering the east corridor, her shoes soundless against the Persian rugs. The wall sconces flickered, casting long shadows across the paintings of grim-faced Hallstein ancestors. One painting caught her eye. It had always been there, Wilhelm's great-grandfather, stern, commanding, a war medal clutched in one hand. But tonight, it seemed like his eyes were following her. She shivered. The door to Wilhelm's study was slightly ajar. That in itself was enough to freeze her. The door had not been opened in 7 years except by Wilhelm himself. He alone had the key. The staff knew to stay away. Even Isabel, with all her entitlement, had once been firmly locked out, yet there it was, open. A flicker of firelight danced inside. For a moment, she stood completely still. Her instincts screamed, walk away, leave it. Whatever's inside isn't meant for you. But there was something in her chest that pressed forward, not curiosity, but compulsion. She stepped in. The study was large, grand, and suffocating. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The desk a massive oak monolith covered in parchment, silver frames, and a crystal decanter of untouched scotch. The only light came from the hearth. In its glow, Wilhelm sat slumped in his leather chair. She knew he was dying the moment she saw him. His face was pale, the usual red rage now replaced by an ashen stillness. One hand rested on his lap, the other gripped a thick envelope sealed with wax. His eyes, sunken and dry, slowly turned to her. Elena, he said. The word broke the silence like glass. He had never called her by name. Not once. She approached slowly, knees threatening to buckle. Take it, he whispered. He held out the envelope. It trembled in his hand. She reached out and took it. It was heavier than she expected. Morgan knows. The vault. The second will. They'll destroy it all. You must act. You must remember who you are. His breathing hitched. He tried to speak again, but his mouth only opened and closed, like a fish stranded on dry land, and then he stilled, not peacefully, not gently, just stopped. She didn't scream, didn't cry. Instead, she looked at the man who had shaped her entire life from behind closed doors and cold commands. And now he was a husk, quiet, fragile, mortal. For a few long minutes, she stood, unmoving. Then slowly, she stepped behind his desk and looked down. There was a half-written letter resting on blotter paper. The ink was still wet. In the margins were scribbled names: Isabel's, Harrow's, hers. Crossed out, rewritten, underlined. The study smelled of old tobacco, the faintest hint of pipe smoke still lingering though he hadn't smoked in years. A painting above the fireplace had shifted slightly on its hook, revealing a crack in the wallpaper behind. She reached forward without thinking and adjusted it, a strange, reflexive act of respect. She turned her gaze back to Wilhelm, and for the first time, noticed something else. A photograph tucked half hidden beneath a stack of yellowed documents. It was a picture of her mother, young, radiant, holding a baby in her arms, Elena. She took the photograph with trembling fingers and held it close, her chest tight. A single tear slid down her cheek before she wiped it away with the back of her sleeve. She exited the study as quietly as she had entered, closing the door gently behind her. In the sanctuary of her small room beneath the stairs, she opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of a new will, dated 3 weeks prior. Everything: the manor, the investments, the international holdings was left not to Isabel, not to Harrow, but to her. To Elena Frey, his daughter. There was also a letter, handwritten, shaky. You were always the strongest. The silence you kept, the loyalty you never owed me, but still gave. I regret not giving you more. They will try to erase you. Don't let them. Elena didn't sleep that night, not a single moment, because she knew the battle hadn't ended. It had just begun, and in the silence, the house seemed to shift. The floorboards groaned, the wind sighed through the cracked window. Shadows danced on her wall, long and uncertain. Somewhere, in the depth of her bones, Elena felt it. A reckoning was coming, and she was no longer the maid. She was the heir. She was the threat. Chapter 4. The war room. Morning broke, but it brought no warmth. Rain hammered the rooftop of Halstein Manor, like war drums. Cold, gray light crept through the lace curtains in Elena's small quarters beneath the stairs. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her. Her fingers still clutched the envelope from last night, its wax seal now broken, its contents burned. Into her mind, she was the heir, she was the enemy. From the very first rays of dawn, the manor shifted. Servants moved more cautiously, eyes darting. Whispers floated like dust motes. Something had changed, and even those who didn't know why could feel the tremor in the air. Silence held a different weight now. Elena, dressed in plain black, a simple turtleneck sweater, black slacks, and boots that didn't creak on the marble floors. She pinned her mother's silver brooch at her collar, a lily curled in steel, the only piece of inheritance she had ever claimed. The halls were emptier than usual. No breakfast clatter from the kitchens, no Isabel screaming for pressed juice, no Harrow slamming doors in his wake. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. She made her way to the northern wing, the heart of the Halstein Empire. The war room. Only two people had keys to that room, Wilhelm and Morgan. But last night, Wilhelm had handed her more than a key. He had handed her a declaration. As she reached the towering oak door, she hesitated. The carved lions on the brass handles glared down at her. For 20 years, she had passed this door with her head bowed, hands full of laundry or trays. Now she stood before it with a key in her hand and fire in her chest. She unlocked the door. The war room was nothing like she imagined. Not a battlefield of steel and smoke, but one of wealth and influence. It was a library fused with a command center. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound ledgers, maps of global holdings, portraits of world leaders Wilhelm had once advised. In the center, a massive round table, hand-carved mahogany, polished until it reflected the stained glass dome overhead. Morgan was already there. He stood in a three-piece suit, as if summoned by instinct. Salt and pepper hair combed back, expression unreadable. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Elena," he said evenly, voice calm like a blade. "We weren't expecting you." "I imagine not," she replied, stepping in fully. "But I'm exactly where I belong." Morgan's eyes dropped to the letter in her hand. "The seal, the signature. So you know, I do." and yet you came alone. Without a lawyer, without backup. Brave, or foolish, maybe both. Morgan gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Wilhelm's death changes many things. It changes everything. He stepped closer, and she stood her ground. You do understand what you're walking into, don't you? This estate, these assets, this life, it's not just a matter of ink and signature. There are stakeholders, families who've waited years, people who've bled for a slice of this empire. Do you really think they'll hand it over to a maid? She raised her chin. I'm not asking. I'm taking what's mine. His smile dropped. The door opened behind them. Isabel walked in, heels clicking like gunshots, hair curled to perfection, even in mourning. Behind her, Harrow in a black turtleneck and stormy expression. The inner circle was gathering. You, Isabel hissed, narrowing her eyes. I knew you'd crawl out of your rat hole. Elena didn't flinch. Good morning, Isabel. I assume you heard. Isabel's lips curled. We heard something about a forged will, a desperate little maid trying to climb where she doesn't belong. I belong here more than you think. Then prove it, Harrow said, stepping forward. Sit at the table. Show us you know the game. And so she did. Elena walked to the head of the table and took the chair. No one else dared touch Wilhelm's chair. The room fell silent. Even Morgan's eyes flicked with something close to shock. She opened the will and placed it at the center of the table. I'm not here to beg. I'm not here to threaten. I'm here because your father chose me. And you'll find I know this house, this empire, far better than either of you ever cared to learn. From her coat, she withdrew a second envelope. Receipts, documents, copies of account movements she'd watched quietly over the years. The siphoned trust funds, the bribes, the missing assets tucked away under fake subsidiaries. She had collected it all. The room was no longer still. It was a battlefield, and Elena Maid no more had just fired the first shot. Chapter 5. Power plays and broken glass. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered. Outside Hallstein Manor, the clouds tore apart like old fabric, revealing a sky uncertain of its own clarity. Inside, the war had already begun. Elena stood alone in Wilhelm's old study. The hearth had long since burned out. What remained were ashes, the smell of scorched paper, and silence. She needed quiet now. Quiet to think, to plan, to prepare. The confrontation in the war room had shattered the old order. Isabel's shrieks still rang in her ears, and Harrow's threats had not gone unnoticed. But it was Morgan's eyes, the way they didn't blink, didn't flinch, that haunted her most. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even touched the documents she laid before him. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a storm he had seen coming long before she had. That meant he had plans too. She took the time to study the contents of the vault Wilhelm had unlocked with his death. Folders upon folders, ledgers, photographs, names, so many names, political donors, compromised officials, investment partners with bloodied pasts. This empire had not been built cleanly, and now it was hers. Downstairs, the staff had already begun to change their rhythm. Elena noticed how the cook, once indifferent, now greeted her with a polite nod. The butler, who had once stepped around her in hallways, now opened doors before she reached them. A shift had begun, subtle but seismic. Some feared her, some watched, some waited. But trust? That would take more than power. Late in the afternoon, a courier arrived. A small, leather-bound notebook. No name, no sender. Inside was a single card. You have one ally. Meet me where the roses rot. Her breath hitched. She knew that phrase. It came from one of Wilhelm's private books of poetry, verses she had dusted weekly, memorized by accident. The quote referred to the abandoned South Garden. She went alone. Twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and rust. The South Garden had once been a spectacle, rows of blooming roses, sculpted fountains, even a marble gazebo. Now it was half overgrown, the roses wild and angry, thorns like claws. She stepped over broken tiles and ducked under hanging ivy. By the time she reached the gazebo, her hands were scratched, and her coat carried the scent of damp earth. Someone waited in the shadows. Who are you? She asked. The figure stepped forward. A woman in her 50s, dressed like a Professor Wool. Coat, gray scarf, ink-stained fingers. My name is Beatrice, she said softly. I was Wilhelm's archivist. And his spy. Elena didn't speak. I know everything, Beatrice continued. About Morgan, about the siblings, about you, and about the real reason Wilhelm wrote that second will. Elena's throat tightened. Why? Beatrice stepped closer, handed her a sealed envelope. Because he was dying. Yes, but also because he was afraid. Not of death, of what they were planning to do with his legacy. With you. Inside the envelope was a photograph. A younger Wilhelm, arms around a woman Elena recognized as her mother. Behind them, Morgan smiling. Your inheritance isn't just money, Beatrice whispered. It's leverage. And they'll do anything to erase you. Lightning cracked in the distance, and Elena realized the real war wasn't over wealth. It was over memory, and she intended to remember everything. Chapter 6. Bloodlines and burn marks. It started with a scar, a jagged burn, barely visible beneath the edge of a photograph. Elena stared at it for hours, trying to understand why Wilhelm had kept such an image tucked behind estate documents until she noticed the truth. It wasn't Wilhelm's scar. It was Morgan's, burned across his left forearm, a detail Elena had never seen herself. But now that she had the photo, it couldn't be unseen. She returned to the war room late that night. The table still bore traces of the earlier confrontation, papers out of place, a forgotten cufflink, the ghost of a fingerprint on polished wood. She spread the documents again, layering them over Wilhelm's maps. The empire spanned continents, but its rot began at home. Beatrice had sent more files, not just from Wilhelm's vault, but from elsewhere, documents too damning to have stayed on the estate. Elena read through them under the dim light of a banker's lamp. Morgan's offshore accounts, his contacts in private security firms, hush payments made to former employees who'd vanished from Hallstein records. One name kept appearing, Levin, a bodyguard dismissed 2 years ago, last seen near the French border. Elena's stomach twisted. She remembered him, a quiet man who'd brought her a bandage once after she'd dropped a tray and cut her hand. He'd disappeared overnight. She picked up the house phone. Find me everything on Levin. The butler paused. Miss, may I ask why? You may not, she said, and hung up. The next morning, the front page of the Financial Gazette carried an article, Hallstein Holdings in flux after founder's death. Beneath the headline was a photo of Wilhelm flanked by Morgan on one side and a blurred figure on the other. It was her. The photo had been cropped, her face indistinct, but Elena recognized the dress, the occasion. A benefit gala for years ago. She'd been serving drinks. The editor had clearly missed the irony. The girl with the tray was now the name beneath the headline. In the dining hall, Isabel shattered a wine glass against the fireplace. She's poisoning everything, Isabel screamed. Wilhelm's memory. This house, she's turning it into a circus. Morgan remained seated, unmoved. She's not a threat because she's loud. She's a threat because she listens. She's a servant. No, Morgan said quietly. She's an heir. And she's reading the playbook we wrote in blood. Elena watched the replay of that outburst later on the manor's security logs. She recorded it, saved it, filed it, because Wilhelm had taught her one thing. In every folded note, every carefully placed clue, knowledge is leverage, and she intended to carry it like a blade. As dusk fell, the report came in. Levin had died under mysterious circumstances. Drowned. No autopsy. No family notified. The same day, his severance was paid in cash. That night, Elena returned to her room and stared at the photo again. The scar, the smile Morgan wore in the photograph with her mother, and suddenly, something broke open inside her, because she wasn't just the heir to an empire, she was the daughter of its greatest betrayal. Chapter 7. The storm beneath the Marbleith. Next morning came with a sun too bright to trust. Hallstein Manor gleamed with unsettling perfection. The marble floors were polished until they reflected the chandelier's sparkle like mirrors. The windows had been scrubbed, even the hedges trimmed to unnatural symmetry. It was as if the house was trying to erase the war boiling beneath its perfect skin, but Elena felt it in every step. The staff moved with a nervous rhythm, slightly too fast, as slightly too wide. A silence had grown like mold in the corners of the manor, one not born of grief, but of fear. Something had shifted again. She descended the staircase dressed in navy silk and low heels that clicked like measured shots on the stone. Her face was calm, her hands gloved, but her eyes were fire. Downstairs, she found Morgan waiting. He stood in the main salon with a crystal glass of water, untouched. Behind him, the grand piano remained closed, though its surface bore a thin line of dust and insult. In a house like this, Elena, he said, voice smooth, almost pleasant, you're becoming quite the symbol. Is that your way of saying, I'm a problem? He raised an eyebrow. You were always a problem. Now you're a powerful one. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked past him, picked up a letter from the console table. The wax seal bore the crest of the Valencia family, the Hallstein's oldest rivals. An invitation, she said. From men who once spat at my name. Ah, Morgan murmured. So you've joined the dance. I'm leading it. He smiled faintly. Then you should know the cost of missteps. Their eyes locked, silence ablaze between them. She returned to the war room. Beatrice was already there, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by charts, legal drafts, and the beginnings of a financial coup. They've begun, Beatrice said without looking up. Morgan shifted the Rotterdam accounts. He's trying to isolate the Eastern holdings. Elena stared at the map. Let him try. They spent the afternoon preparing. Elena signed documents with a hand that didn't shake. She made calls to names she'd once whispered in fear. She listened, learned, countered. By nightfall, she had blocked 2 transfers and frozen one of Morgan's hidden LLCs. But it wasn't enough, because that night, a scream split the silence. Elena was the first to reach the second-floor gallery. A maid knelt beside a body at the foot of the stairs. Blood streaked the marble like paint. Isabel. She was alive but barely. Paramedics arrived within minutes. No one knew how it happened. A misstep, they said. A fall. But Elena knew better. Isabel didn't misstep. She danced in stilettos like a blade wielder. This wasn't a fall. It was a message. And somewhere in the shadows of Hallstein Manor, someone was watching. Someone wanted her gone. Not just from the will, from the world. Chapter 8. Queen's Gambit. There were moments when pain becomes prophecy. That night, as Elena stood in the hospital corridor with blood on her cuffs and silence in her lungs, she knew she had crossed a threshold that would not permit retreat. Isabel had survived. A broken clavicle, 3 cracked ribs, mild concussion, but no memory of the fall, or so she claimed. Elena had stood by her hospital bed, arms crossed, watching Isabel blink under the glow of sterile lights. There had been fear in her sister's eyes, real fear, not of death, but of something else, of being forgotten, of being irrelevant. Who did this? Isabel had whispered, voice raw. Elena hadn't answered. She simply placed a paper crane on the bedside table, white, silent, sharp at the edges. She returned to Hallstein Manor with mud on her heels and war on her mind. Beatrice was waiting in the war room. He knows it wasn't an accident, Beatrice said, not looking up from the files. Good. Elena unpinned her coat. Let him know I'm not the one bleeding. Beatrice slid a folder across the table. We traced the wire transfers. One went through an art gallery in Prague. Guess who owns it? Elena opened the folder. Morgan's name glared from the page like a wound. And the timing? She asked. An hour before Isabel's fall. It was time. Elena changed. Not into morning black, but midnight red. A tailored dress that clung like armor. Heels sharp enough to wound. Her hair twisted into a crown braid. Eyes lined in smoke. Lips a quiet, murderous crimson. That night, she hosted the first Hallstein Gala since Wilhelm's death. The ballroom blazed with light. Music poured like honey. The air shimmered with old money and newer threats. Every major figure in the Hallstein orbit was present: shareholders, politicians, old allies, quiet enemies dressed in couture, and Elena. She walked through them like a queen through a chessboard, smiling, sipping, stopping just long enough to whisper something in someone's ear before moving on. Every move rehearsed, every word a blade in velvet. Morgan arrived late. He wore charcoal gray. His eyes didn't blink enough. Bold of you, he murmured as they met beneath the chandelier. Isn't it? She smiled. I've always liked full circles. He clinked his glass to hers. You think you've won? No, she said. I think I've begun. Before he could reply, she turned to the podium. The music faded. The crowd hushed. She took the microphone and in a voice as clear as crystal, she said, Tonight, I stand not just as a Hallstein, but as a woman who served this family, who loved it, who bled for it. I inherited more than titles. I inherited its secrets, its debts, its ghosts, and I am not afraid. There was no applause, just a silence that cracked with electricity. Then she dropped the bomb. One more thing, she said, lifting a folder. Tomorrow, I will release documents detailing the misuse of Hallstein funds siphoned by one of our own. The evidence is thorough. The penalties will be legal and permanent. She looked straight at Morgan. He did not flinch, but his knuckles whitened around the glass. Checkmate wasn't loud. It was a whisper, and that night, Elena whispered it in front of an empire. Chapter 9. The backlash. The morning after the gala arrived not with triumph but with thunder. Rain lashed against the stone balustrades of Hallstein Manor as if trying to tear away its history. The storm had not passed. It had only grown teeth. Elena stood at the edge of the veranda, phone pressed to her ear, her eyes watching the drive as though expecting fire to roll through it. They're calling it a stunt. Beatrice's voice came through, low and sharp. The board is split. Half of them say you're brave. The other half say you're dangerous. I am dangerous, Elena replied. That's the point. Inside the manor, the fallout had already begun. 2 maids resigned that morning, one in tears, one in silence. The chef sent word that suppliers were pulling out of their contracts. 3 minor shareholders leaked anonymous statements to the press accusing Elena of emotional manipulation and coercive tactics. And the media? They devoured it. Elena's face was everywhere, headlines calling her the Maid Queen, the marble heiress, the Red Widow of Hallstein. Some lauded her as a feminist icon. Others painted her as a usurper, a viper in silk. Morgan, of course, was silent. That terrified her more than anything. She returned to the war room to find it locked. The lock wasn't the one she had used. It had been changed. She stared at the new pad, a biometric scanner, high-end, unauthorized. Beatrice arrived seconds later, breath short. He moved fast. He's sealing the battlefield, Elena murmured. Which means he's bleeding. Beatrice handed her a file. But we're not out of knives. Inside were blueprints, not of the manor, but of a clinic, offshore, registered under an alias tied to Morgan's shell corporations. What is this? Elena asked. A safe house, Beatrice replied. A place for erasing records, identities, people. There was a moment of absolute silence. Elena closed the file slowly. We burn it. That night, she made a call, not to lawyers, not to press.to Victor Radu. He answered with a laugh. Ah, the girl with the lion's heart. You once said you'd owe me a favor, she said. I did. I'm collecting. Pause. Then, where and when? She gave him the coordinates. The next morning, the offshore facility appeared in the news, empty, abandoned, with traces of incinerated documents. Photos leaked. Investigations launched. Morgan's face made the news for the first time in a decade, and Hallstein's walls shook. But in the manor's darkest hallway, as Elena passed a cracked mirror, she saw something that made her pause. A name scratched faintly into the wood beneath the frame. Lucinda. Her mother's name. It wasn't over. It was never just about money. It was about blood, and some blood still burned. Chapter 10. Bloodline. Hallstein Manor had always carried ghosts, fragments of whispers that echoed through the walls, secrets stitched into the very tapestries, and the kind of silence that lingered too long to be innocent. Elena just never expected one of those ghosts to write back. It was the name that did it. Lucinda. Not scribbled hastily or etched in dust, but scrawled beneath the hallway mirror like a final confession, too stubborn to stay buried. It wasn't written in ink or charcoal but in blood, dried and faded into the oak grain, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, as if the house itself had tried to swallow the memory and failed. She stared at it for a full minute, her breath trapped in her lungs, her pulse roaring in her ears like the tide. Then, without a word, she turned and walked quick steps carrying her down the west wing, past shuttered windows and half-dead plants, down the back servants' stairs that creaked under her weight, and finally into the forbidden depths beneath. The manor, the archives were a tomb of forgotten history, layered in dust so thick it dulled even the sharpest corners. Shelves sagged under the weight of neglected ledgers, boxes stuffed with brittle paper, and family records no one wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't the Hallstein legacy polished for donors or displayed in press releases. This was the rot, the blood-stained truth that had been boarded up and left to mold. Beatrice found her 2 hours later. Elena was kneeling on the stone floor, in a ring of open boxes, hands blackened with ink and grime, her hair fallen loose from its pins, her eyes locked on a single folder in her lap. Elena? Beatrice's voice was cautious, but Elena didn't flinch. She looked up slowly, her face pale but her gaze burning not with fear, but with fury. She didn't die in an accident, Elena said, her voice a low rasp that barely rose above the humming silence. She was erased. Beatrice stepped further in, careful not to knock over any of the fragile chaos. What did you find? Elena held out the folder with trembling fingers. Letters. From my mother. To Wilhelm. They were folded neatly, hidden between pages of a financial ledger from 1989, like someone had wanted to preserve them without making them known. 6 pages in her mother's unmistakable handwriting, each word saturated with desperation, love, and growing terror. Pleas to be heard, warnings to be heeded. And then, finally, a silence that never lifted. She knew something. Something about the inheritance. About Morgan. About me. Beatrice thumbed through the papers, her brow furrowed. These are dated just months before she died. She begged Wilhelm to protect me, Elena whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. To name me. And he didn't, Beatrice said flatly, or he couldn't. They sat like that, 2 women hunched in a crypt of memory while the storm above raged harder, pounding against the world like a warning. Elena, Beatrice said after a long pause, her voice carrying a different weight now. We need to talk about the ledger. Elena's stomach clenched. Which one? Beatrice reached into her satchel and pulled out a thin red book, worn to softness, its leather cracked and unlabeled. The one Morgan doesn't know we have. Elena opened it slowly. Inside, in tight, almost obsessive handwriting, was a second set of accounts. Names, offshore numbers, cash flows designed to disappear. And at the very bottom, a single transaction that made the air leave her lungs. Lucinda Ainsworth, £30,000, to a Dr. Emmerich. Purpose, maternal procedure. And no further details. Elena blinked rapidly. Her lips parted, but no words formed. The name Emmerich pulsed in her brain like a siren. He had been discredited. Years ago, once a pioneering geneticist, later a fugitive in medical circles. He was whispered about in university corridors and dark corners of hospital politics. He specialized in DNA tampering, embryo alteration, and identity erasure. Beatrice's voice was almost tender. Elena, I think, you were never meant to be known. It hit her like a blade. Not only had they erased her mother from the official narrative, they had tried to erase her before she was even born. She wasn't just the heir Wilhelm had hidden, she was the ticking time bomb they prayed would never ignite. And now, the storm outside howled with renewed vengeance. She wasn't just the heir, she was the secret, and if the house wanted to burn, she would be the match. Chapter 11. Awakening. Rain hadn't stopped. By morning, Hallstein Manor resembled a fortress besieged by the sky itself, gray sheets of water drumming against the ancient windows, the wind whistling through cracks like the morning song of ghosts long thought buried. Elena stood at the tall window of the library, hands clasped behind her back, her reflection a pale shimmer against the glass. Her eyes were not red from weeping, they were hollow with calculation. The night had changed her, not in some poetic way, not like a heroine embracing fate. It had been brutal, a chisel cracking something calcified, a revelation so sharp it peeled back every shield she'd ever built around herself. She had spent her whole life apologizing for the space she occupied. Now she wanted to claim every inch of it. Behind her, Beatrice stepped softly into the room, carrying a silver tray with coffee and a single folded newspaper. It was the London Times, an article circled in red ink. Elena didn't need to look to know what it was. Morgan Hallstein, the public face of Hallstein Industries, had just secured a seat on the European Energy Board. A triumph, a headline, a distraction. He thinks he's won, Beatrice said quietly. Elena didn't move. Let him. They sat in silence. For a moment longer, the storm raging outside like a war that hadn't yet breached the gates. Then, she turned. How fast can you get me to Munich? Beatrice blinked. Munich. That's where Emmerich disappeared. If he's still alive, someone there knows. Beatrice hesitated. Elena, this man isn't just disgraced. He's dangerous. His research, what he did, I need to know what I am. Elena cut in, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. Not what they told me, not what the ledgers imply. The truth, from the source. Beatrice studied her for a long beat before nodding. I'll make the call. Elena watched the reflection of the storm in the glass, a strange calm settling over her like a second skin. Something was shifting, not just in the house, but in her. She wasn't the girl who waited anymore. She was the woman who hunted. Downstairs, in the east parlor, the portrait of Wilhelm Hallstein stared blankly from above the fireplace. He had painted over Lucinda's face in the family canvas, but Elena would make sure the world remembered every brushstroke, even if she had to carve it into stone. Chapter 11. Awakening. Rain hadn't stopped. By morning, Hallstein Manor resembled a fortress besieged by the sky itself, gray sheets of water drumming against the ancient windows, the wind whistling through cracks like the morning song of ghosts long thought buried. Elena stood at the tall window of the library, hands clasped behind her back, her reflection a pale shimmer against the glass. Her eyes were not red from weeping, they were hollow with calculation. The night had changed her, not in some poetic way, not like a heroine embracing fate. It had been brutal, a chisel cracking something calcified, a revelation so sharp it peeled back every shield she'd ever built around herself. She had spent her whole life apologizing for the space she occupied. Now she wanted to claim every inch of it. Behind her, Beatrice stepped softly into the room, carrying a silver tray with coffee and a single folded newspaper. It was the London Times, an article circled in red ink. Elena didn't need to look to know what it was. Morgan Halstein, the public face of Halstein Industries, had just secured a seat on the European Energy Board. A triumph, a headline, a distraction. He thinks he's won, Beatrice said quietly. Elena didn't move. Let him. They sat in silence. For a moment longer, the storm raging outside like a war that hadn't yet breached the gates. Then, she turned. How fast can you get me to Munich? Beatrice blinked. Munich. That's where Emmerich disappeared. If he's still alive, someone there knows. Beatrice hesitated. Elena, this man isn't just disgraced. He's dangerous. His research, what he did, I need to know what I am. Elena cut in, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. Not what they told me, not what the ledgers imply. The truth, from the source. Beatrice studied her for a long beat before nodding. I'll make the call. Elena watched the reflection of the storm in the glass, a strange calm settling over her like a second skin. Something was shifting, not just in the house, but in her. She wasn't the girl who waited anymore. She was the woman who hunted. Downstairs, in the east parlor, the portrait of Wilhelm Halstein stared blankly from above the fireplace. He had painted over Lucinda's face in the family canvas, but Elena would make sure the world remembered every brushstroke, even if she had to carve it into stone. Chapter 12. Munich City welcomed her with cold air and indifference. Munich was no stranger to secrets that were them well, like the gold-trimmed facades of its historic squares or the way morning fog curled like silk around the towers of Frauenkirche. But Elena wasn't here for beauty. She was here for the shadows beneath it. The car Beatrice arranged met her at Flughafen am Enchen. The driver didn't speak except to confirm her name. By the time they reached the old district of Schwabing, dusk had draped itself over the rooftops, and the rain, stubborn and relentless, followed her like a curse from Halstein Manor. The apartment was on the third floor of a narrow building with ivy clawing up its stone walls. No elevator, no name on the buzzer, just a brass plaque that read, Dr. Emmerich Private Consultations. Faded, almost forgotten, but still there. She rang once, then again. Nothing. Just as she turned to leave, the door clicked. A sliver of warm light split the darkness, and a figure emerged. Male, tall, slight limp. His face was thinner than the photo she had seen in the archived journals, and time had made his eyes even sharper. You shouldn't be here, he said in German. The voice was brittle. Then, switching to English, you bring Halstein's rot to my doorstep? I bring my mother's ghost, Elena replied, and my name, which I never got to choose. Emmerich narrowed his gaze. What do you want? The truth. A pause. Then reluctantly, he stepped aside. Inside, the apartment was a chaos of books, loose pages, and the metallic scent of old medical equipment. A microscope sat on the table beside a cold cup of tea. Charts lined the walls, gene maps, blood markers, fetal development studies annotated in a mix of German, Latin, and anger. You are Elena Halstein, he said. Yes, you shouldn't exist. I've heard that before. He studied her face like a test subject. They paid me to ensure your mother's pregnancy went unnoticed. They didn't tell me she was in love with Wilhelm, that she wanted to keep you, and you went along with it. I gave her a choice, he said softly. She chose you. Elena's breath caught. He pulled out an old folder, yellowed, bound in twine. Her name, Elena, was scribbled across it in a shaky hand. You were not altered, he said, but you were hidden. A fake donor profile, masked DNA trail. Wilhelm didn't want you born into the line, but he also couldn't bear to erase you. So he found me. I kept you out of their system. Until now. Why now? Emmerich looked at her with something close to sorrow. Because you're no longer the secret. You're the threat. Outside, the storm rolled closer. And inside Elena's chest, something old and furious finally began to wake. Chapter 13. The mirror Helena walked through the corridors of the Bayerisches National Museum as if navigating a dream. The museum was quiet that morning, just the shuffle of shoes on marble, the echo of distant conversations, and the subtle hum of a city that had not yet realized a reckoning was coming. She was no longer simply retracing her lineage. She was mapping a war. Dr. Emmerich's file burned in her leather satchel like a live coal. Every name, every falsified record, every blood test masked under a fabricated donor id. This was the anatomy of erasure. Wilhelm hadn't just hidden her. He had rewritten her out of history. But history had a cruel habit of resurfacing. She stopped in front of a 19th century triptych, its gilded panels flanking a central mirror. Once, she had avoided her own reflection, afraid of what she'd see. Now she stared into it with a defiant steadiness in her eyes. She no longer saw the girl who had served tea in silence. She saw Lucinda's fire. She saw Wilhelm's ruthlessness. And something else, something entirely her own. "You look like her." The voice came from behind. A woman in her 60s, clothed in the understated black of someone who had spent a lifetime in the shadows of wealth. Her name tag read, Ingrid Collections Archivist. Elena turned. "Lucinda?" Ingrid nodded. "I was her maid, long ago, before the silence, before the painting was altered." "You knew?" Elena asked. "I saw too much and said too little," Ingrid replied, voice thick with regret. "But I never forgot. She fought for you, even when they took everything. She made me promise one thing." Elena's heart thudded. "What?" "That if you ever came back, I'd take you to the mirror hall." Ingrid led her through a side entrance, down a staircase that smelled of cedar and old wax. Beneath the museum, past locked doors and dusty archives, was a vault sealed with biometric locks. Ingrid's thumbprint was one of the few that still worked. Inside was a room unlike anything Elena had expected. Walls lined with reflective glass, not just mirrors, but translucent panes behind which hung copies of family portraits, medical records, and a full oil painting. Lucinda Hallstein, pregnant, standing defiantly beside an unfinished canvas of Wilhelm. "This is what he buried," Ingrid said. Elena stepped closer. Her breath misted the glass. The painting glowed under the museum lights. The brushwork was unmistakably Wilhelm's, precise, obsessive, and haunted. He had tried to erase her mother, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy this. Tears welled, but Elena did not let them fall. She turned to Ingrid. "I'm going to reclaim everything." Ingrid smiled faintly. "Then start here, with the truth." Chapter 14. The First Movie. The time Elena returned to the flat in Schwabing, dusk had painted the rooftops in bruised shades of purple and blue. The air was sharp, laced with the chill of coming frost, but inside her chest, the heat of decision smoldered. No longer the seeker. Now, she was the spark. Beatrice was already there, seated on the sofa, a laptop open before her and a burner phones on the table. The woman had moved like a ghost through the upper echelons of European power for years. Now, she was Elena's shadow and her sword. "We start with the board," Beatrice said without pleasantries. 5 of the 12 members have direct ties to Hallstein Industries. If we dismantle their credibility, the empire begins to crack. Elena sat across from her, pulling the leather folder from her bag and laying it on the table like a holy relic. "Use this, but I want it clean. No chaos for the press to devour. No spectacle, just collapse." Beatrice raised a brow. "That's not revenge. That's precision." "Good." They worked through the night. A digital dossier of decades of corporate corruption emerged: shell companies, bribes masked as grants, medical trials that disappeared from public record. Elena's fingers didn't shake as she signed the first anonymous submission packet. She was done shaking. At dawn, she stood by the window, watching the sun smear gold across the Alps in the distance. For the first time, she didn't feel like a fraud inside the body of a Hallstein. She felt like the reckoning that bloodline deserved. When the first email hit the inbox of a global watchdog agency that morning, Elena simply whispered, "Let it begin." The backlash began by midweek. One of the board members, Hans-Dieter Keller, a longtime executive in Hallstein's mining operations, was suspended from his post in Geneva after leaked files revealed environmental violations in Tanzania and falsified audits. The media began to circle. Investors started whispering. Beatrice showed Elena a graph on the screen. Hallstein stock was slipping. "That's one," she said. "Keep going," Elena replied. The next strike was more surgical, a lawsuit against a Hallstein subsidiary for unauthorized pharmaceutical trials in Eastern Europe, filed anonymously, backed by reams of damning evidence. Elena watched the news report like someone watching a match catch. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady. But Morgan was watching too. On Friday morning, a courier arrived at her apartment. No name, just a black envelope. Inside, a photo of her mother's grave, fresh flowers, and a note in immaculate handwriting. We all bury ghosts, Elena. Some stay buried, some don't. She stared at the note for a long time, then placed it on the table and set a small ceramic bowl over it. She lit a match and dropped it in. As the paper curled into ash, Elena whispered, "You're next." Chapter 15. Retaliation. Sun rose over Munich in shades of steel gray, casting long shadows through the tall windows of the Schwabing flat. Elena stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers wrapped around a chipped porcelain mug, its contents long gone cold. Sleep had eluded her. The note Morgan sent still echoed in her mind, not because it threatened her, but because it signaled a shift. He was no longer pretending. Beatrice entered, dressed in a dark gray coat, her hair pulled back, her eyes sharper than usual. She placed a folder on the table. They've hired a firm, Arcadia Global. Cyber ops, information warfare, and discreditation campaigns. They don't go for courtrooms. They go for blood. Elena nodded slowly. Expected. They already flagged your hospital internship in Florence. There's an anonymous article brewing online, suggesting you falsified credentials. Elena didn't flinch. Let them. Truth has stronger legs than rumors. Beatrice's expression darkened. But not faster legs. Elena tapped her finger against the mug's rim. Then we get faster. That afternoon, Elena visited Dr. Adele Rothschild, a retired legal advisor who once served as an internal investigator for Hallstein Industries. Now in her 70s, Adele lived in a modest house in the Bavarian countryside. Her spine was curved, but her eyes held the same fire as the woman Elena remembered from Lucinda's journals. "You look like your mother," Adele said as she poured tea into mismatched cups. "She once came here too, desperate, brave, pregnant. I'm here to finish what she couldn't," Elena replied. Adele didn't blink. "Then take this." She slid a small wooden box across the table. Inside, documents with Hallstein letterheads, notes in Lucinda's handwriting, receipts that traced hush money, and most damning audio tapes. "She recorded them?" Elena whispered. Adele's eyes gleamed. She knew what Wilhelm was capable of. She wanted to leave a time bomb. Back in the flat that evening, Elena and Beatrice digitized everything. The audio was crackling, but clear enough. Wilhelm's voice, mentions of the girl, hush payments, and a chilling sentence: "If she ever resurfaces, make sure she disappears again quietly." Elena sat back, her skin cold. Beatrice looked at her. "This is your nuke." Elena shook her head. "This is my shield. I want him to see it coming. I want him to know it was me." She drafted a message and sent it directly to Morgan's encrypted corporate inbox. No threats. Just a single audio clip attached with the subject line: "She never disappeared. And neither will I." That night, she didn't hide. She dressed in black and attended a Hallstein gala, entering through the front doors of the Palais Ehrlich as if she owned it. Whispers followed her. Camera phones flicked up like daggers. Beatrice moved beside her like a phantom. Morgan was there. Their eyes met across the marble ballroom. He smiled, slow and venomous. "You're making quite a scene," he said when she finally reached him. Elena lifted her glass. "I thought you liked theatrics." His eyes flicked to the ceiling. "What do you want?" "The truth to burn." He leaned in close. "You don't know how deep this goes." She didn't step back. "Then you should be afraid of how far I'm willing to dig." And with that, she turned away, leaving him frozen in the middle of his empire's masquerade, the strings of a violin quartet unraveling behind her like the final notes before a collapse. Outside, the wind howled. Inside her, a storm had just begun. Chapter 16. Kolop Semyonich's sky darkened early that evening, as if in sync with the undercurrents rippling through Hallstein Industries. Elena sat in the corner of the flat study, her eyes locked onto the glowing laptop screen. The digital files from Adele were now backed up in 6 different locations, some in the cloud, others sent to private journalists under the code name Lucinda's Testimony. Beatrice stood by the window, watching the mist thicken over the city rooftops. "We made a dent," she said, voice low. "But now they'll come faster and harder." Elena nodded. "Good, then they'll expose themselves." Her phone vibrated. A single notification. Breaking. Whistleblower reveals Hallstein's dark history of corporate cover-ups. The first article had gone live. And it was brutal. Screenshots of old ledgers. Photos of young interns listed as consultants in shell companies. Quotes from Lucinda's journals. And the audio file, its chilling final line looping in the background of the article's embedded player. If she resurfaces. By midnight, the board at Hallstein convened an emergency meeting. Morgan paced across a conference room of fire and fury, barking into his phone, "Track the leak. I don't care if you have to pay $10,000 a minute. Find out who gave that audio to the press." But deep down, he already knew. A junior executive named Hannah whispered to her colleague as they exited the room, "This is going to end someone's career." "It already has," the colleague replied. "They just don't know it yet." Meanwhile, Elena wasn't done. She flew overnight to Geneva, where Hallstein's secret philanthropic arm, the Arcturus Foundation, had funneled millions under the guise of aid. The offices were sleek, glass-walled, soulless. But she wasn't there for aesthetics. She was there for Eric Baumann, a former protégé of Wilhelm Hallstein, now head of the foundation, and the keeper of their darkest files. "You shouldn't be here," Eric said, pale-faced as she stepped into his office. Uninvited, Elena smiled thinly. "Neither should you. But here we are. I have nothing to say to you." She slid a copy of Lucinda's death certificate across his desk. "Forged," she whispered. "Want to know how I know? Because the coroner who signed it has been dead since 2001. Eric's hands trembled. "You helped bury my mother's life," she continued. "Now you're going to help exhume it. Or I release the other 3 tapes." His gaze darted to the door, then to the security camera above. He nodded once. 2 hours later, Elena left the building with 3 encrypted drives and a non-disclosure agreement signed under duress. Back in the hotel, Beatrice greeted her with a grim expression. "They're retaliating in Brussels. You've been named in a lawsuit. Fraud, espionage, corporate theft." Elena sank into the velvet chair. "Let them build the gallows. I'll light the match." Outside, the snow began to fall. Inside, her war had just become a revolution. Chapter 17. Reckoning's lawsuit hit international headlines the following morning. News anchors whispered her name like a curse and a prophecy all at once. Elena Richter, daughter of Lucinda Hallstein, indicted on multiple counts across 3 jurisdictions. But Elena didn't flinch. Inside the hotel suite in Brussels, she stood by the window as fog coiled through the ancient streets below. Church bells rang in the distance, melancholy and defiant. Beatrice, now glued to her second phone, read aloud statements from media outlets, political analysts, and PR firms, all scrambling to pick a side. "They're spinning the narrative fast," she muttered. "Victim turned saboteur. You're now the disgraced heir." Elena's reply was quiet but steady. "Good. That means they're scared." She opened her laptop, checking the auto timestamp trackers she embedded in each piece of leaked data. One signal blinked red. It had been accessed by someone inside Hallstein's Zurich office. Not Morgan. Not even someone on the board. It was Wilhelm's personal assistant, an old man named Kurt Weiss. A man who had been silent for decades. The train ride to Zurich was long and hushed. Snow streaked past the windows as Elena sat in solitude, watching her reflection blur across the glass. Her heart thudded quietly beneath her coat, but her mind moved like a blade, sharp, focused. She met Kurt in a nursing home outside the city. He was older than she remembered from childhood photos, frailer, but the moment he saw her, his hands clenched the sides of the wheelchair. "I always knew you'd come," he whispered. Elena pulled up a chair. "You know why I'm here. I kept things hidden, not because I believed in him, but because I was afraid of what he might do, of what it would cost your mother if I failed. And now," he reached into a hollowed-out book on his lap. Inside was a worn USB drive, taped in the spine. The original contracts, names, codes, and the day your mother disappeared. "I logged it." He made a call to someone in Croatia. "I recorded the timestamp." Elena took the drive with reverence, her fingers trembling only once. "Why are you giving this to me now?" "Because you're the only one who scares him." Back in Brussels, Elena and Beatrice launched a final offensive, a global email drop sent to over 1,000 journalists, prosecutors, and NGOs. Embedded within was an unredacted file called the Hallstein Doctrine, the very blueprint of corruption, fraud, and generational abuse. Everything Wilhelm tried to erase, now a matter of public record. Within 48 hours, the Hallstein stock plummeted, 3 board members resigned, Interpol opened an investigation, and somewhere in the back halls of the Bundestag, a senior parliamentarian drafted a statement calling for Wilhelm Hallstein's immediate arrest. But victory was never clean. That night, Elena's hotel room was broken into. No valuables were taken, but her mother's locket, the one she wore around her neck every day, was gone. In its place was a card, ivory and gold, with one word printed in embossed Gothic script. Enough. Elena stared at it, then crushed it in her fist. No, she whispered. Not yet. Chapter 18. Redemption. Locket was never found, but Elena wore its absence like a badge. It reminded her what was lost and what had been reclaimed in return. Across the continent, Hallstein Industries unraveled in real time. The once impenetrable empire bled headlines and indictments, while shareholders fled like rats from a sinking ship. In a quiet courtroom in Geneva, Wilhelm Hallstein was finally arraigned. The once revered patriarch sat hollow-eyed in the defendant's box, surrounded by layers of legal armor that now looked brittle and meaningless. Elena didn't attend the hearing. She watched from a distance, sipping lukewarm coffee in a small cafe across the street. The windows rattled from passing trams. The people outside bustled by without recognizing her. It was exactly how she wanted it. Beatrice slid into the booth across from her, dropping a folded newspaper on the table. The headline read, Hallstein faces 20 counts. Public apology still absent. He's been denied bail, she said simply. Interpol froze his overseas accounts. Zurich's court accepted Kurt's testimony and the files from Eric. It's over. Elena looked up from her cup. No, it's ending. That's different. Beatrice leaned back. You could run the company, you know. The board's in chaos. The name's still powerful. You could remake it. Elena's eyes drifted toward the river. That name killed my mother. That name bled people dry behind the curtains of philanthropy. I don't want to remake it. I want to outgrow it. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet weight of finality settling between them. 1 month later, Elena stood in front of a modest, sunlit building on the outskirts of Lisbon. A brass plaque near the door read, The Richter Foundation. Justice, access, healing. Inside, children's laughter echoed from a reading room. Survivors of corporate exploitation received legal aid and psychological counseling. And in a tucked-away office, framed in oak, was a single photo, Lucinda Hallstein holding baby Elena in her arms, both mid-laugh. She had made it home. The past did not vanish. It hung behind her like an old painting heavy with story, but no longer defining her. One morning, Beatrice handed her a small parcel with no return address. Inside was the missing lock at .no note. Just the locket. Elena opened it slowly. Inside was a new photo, her and Lucinda, digitally restored, standing beneath a willow tree neither had ever visited. She smiled, then whispered, Thank you, and turned toward the light.